one thing before anything else, which is that this final session was actually originally planned to be held in German, and now to be as accessible as possible to everybody, we decided to switch to English. So bear with us, with everybody on the panel and the keynote and everything, because we're sort of doing simultaneous translation to some extent. Yeah, but the session will now be in English. Very exciting session, a bit different to the ones we've had earlier, because now it's about putting things into practice. So this is very policy focused. What can you do with experimental policy making in Germany? We had a first session this morning on experimental innovation policy, where some interesting points were made on the role of champions, the role that legislation plays in this field. We then had a session on evidence-based healthcare and science policy, where obviously we had a presentation on the importance of data and data access, including at the European level. But the question really is, okay, what does this look like in practice? How can we put all of this in practice to have more evidence in policymaking? And you could argue both ways. You could argue that at times of budget, fiscal constraints, we don't have the money to invest in more evidence. But you could also, of course, say that right now is the time to look at cost effectiveness of different interventions. Therefore, this is very much something we should focus on. So let me first of all introduce myself. My name is Michael Braun. I'm a policy manager at JPAL Europe. JPAL is a network of researchers around the world who use policy experiments to inform mostly policy related to poverty alleviation and social inequalities. We have as a keynote speaker Simon Jäger, who is an associate professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University, and who between 2024 and 2025 was advising the German Ministry of the Economy and Climate Change on, among other things, evidence-based policymaking, how to make policy more evidence-based. We're also going to later on have three panelists that I'm going to introduce at that point. But first of all, let me welcome Simon Jäger to the stage for about 15 minutes of keynote. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Super excited to be here, and I think it seems like a fantastic event, and I'm very happy to hear that JPAL is here as well, represented Michael and perhaps others as well. So this might be a bit awkward because I wrote down some remarks in German, and now I guess I have to like live translate what I'm going to say. So first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So start by saying that political decisions are always like bets on the future, right? They're rarely without risk, but hopefully not blind. And evidence-based policymaking means that those bets will not be just based on interests, on intuitions, or on the loudness of whoever are perhaps the interested actors in a society, but on systematic facts, a body of evidence. Why is that valuable? So one is, the key reason I would argue is the effective use of scarce resources. It's in some sense the original meaning of the word economics, distribution of resources among scarce resources among competing ends. So particular public means are always scarce. And evidence will improve the probability that each euro will lead to a social return instead of creating symbolism or completely wasted. Second, and I think this is particularly important, is democratic legitimacy. So I think citizens will build trust if they can understand and they can trust that decisions will be based on data, based on transparent processes, especially in times when trust is breaking down. So I was just looking at the numbers, and in Germany, only 25% of citizens that were surveyed believe that the state is capable of essentially fulfilling its tasks. So I think that's a very concerning number, and I think what we need is to provide processes that can be a sustainable antidote against that. And the third argument I would say is the adaptability of the state. So in a world of multiple crises, no single reform package by itself can satisfy all of the competing demands that different actors, all of us, will place on it. And so an evidence-based approach can essentially be the basis for feedback loops of measuring, implementing, learning, and then adjusting once again. In short, evidence does not create power per se for policy, but I would say some amount of humility. So it forces us to take the world as it is not how we would like it to be. And I think that will be a recipe in the long run for better decisions, and more importantly, the basis for that, which I think is trust of the public in the quality of the decision making. So why is this bridge between, I think, what we want to achieve and where we are so wide, even in many highly developed knowledge societies? I would say there are 4 key hurdles from my perspective that are kind of like general across many countries, perhaps like you could say like the OECD. And I want to mention those before speaking about a couple that I think are specifically or specific to the German case. So what divides research, the realm of research and evidence making from the realm of policy making with regards to the question that is before us? So first of all, I think if we think about systems theory, these are completely different systems, right, with their own logics. And so that manifests itself in a number of different ways. One is timing and time. So there's this asynchronous cycles. So research projects will last years. Sadly, in one recent case, I've been working on decades. Whereas like political decision windows are often just days or weeks. And so that's, I think, like a fundamental difference in this asynchronity of how we go about things. And the other one is this difference between these systems and the incentives of the different actors in these systems really collide. So I think researchers prize novelty and methods, whereas like in the policy domain, it is correctly other dimensions that are more important. For example, visibility, feasibility, and then something I have noticed in kind of like the brief stint I've had in talking to policymakers. I think politicians often also think a lot about how susceptible is something I'm going to propose to incitement in the media, for example, to like a news media campaign that will kind of like flip something upside down and make it into something else. And I think that's like a key risk and a key constraint that many policymakers fail. So the German word, I think, is perhaps even more Verhetzbarkeit. I think is like a key concern that many policymakers have in mind. And so it's these two, systems logics that are colliding in some sense. Third challenge, and I think is also ubiquitous, is like the selective use of evidence, right? So political actors sometimes will be interested in finding evidence that will support something that they have been planning all along, right? So instead of kind of like having an open, open-ended process that will take us wherever the data lead us, there will be kind of like post hoc evidence making or policy-based evidence making, right? And then institutionally, and I understand this is particularly valuable because, today's event is particularly valuable because it seeks to fill that gap. I think the lack of interpreters between these two systems, right? Kind of like permanent evidence brokers between, let's say, ministries and universities and so on. And I'm looking forward to the debate afterwards as well, where we can perhaps talk about what role that can be. So those are kind of like fairly general, and they're, I would argue, not just specific to the German case. What makes it perhaps sometimes so particularly hard in Germany? So one is kind of like a banal argument, is the data infrastructure, right? So Germany has like completely splintered registers. So unlike, for example, our Scandinavian peers, many other countries where we do a lot of exciting work, combined with fairly strict data protection. So I think the number one priority in Germany will be modernization of registries, Registermodernisierung, and then also, a research data law, Forschungsdatengesetz. I think those are kind of like key foundational blocks that, will have large dividends both for research and for policy for decades to come. The second one is federalism, right? The fact that Germany has essentially 16 state actors that are very powerful, and a federal government, which sometimes make it hard to implement and scale up policies. However, in principle, having lots of different, states could be an amazing case for, or an amazing setting to conduct a lot of experiments. So why does it not work in Germany? And I think the fundamental reason is kind of like a political culture of caution and kind of like the systematic philosophical underpinnings of, I think, at the end of the day, ethics in Germany, which I think follows a very much Kantian approach, follows the categorical imperative, that something is good if it is good by principle and coming from first principles, regardless of what the outcome is, right? That's literally what the categorical imperative in some sense is, as opposed to kind of like a more, let's say, in some cases, utilitarian or pragmatic, let's say, Anglo-Saxon philosophical approach that will, judge, for example, the ethical desirability of an action or of a policy from its ends rather than from its means, right? And so I think that is ingrained in kind of like political culture in German ethics, and that I think is like, in some sense, unfortunately, very antithetical to kind of experiments, both in the sense of randomized controlled trials, but also in the sense of like trying out new things and kind of like trying and failing and adjusting, because you want to kind of like come up with like a perfect solution and then implement it, right? The last one I would mention is kind of like the corporatism of special interests in Germany. So I think Germany has like an institutionalized system where business associations, but also unions are directly involved in policy making from the earliest stages on. And that, I think, kind of like narrows the scope for what policy can do, because a lot of ideas are kind of like dead on arrival, because, special interests will be able to stop it even within a ministry at an early stage. And so evidence that collides with special interests has a hard time in this setting. So the result is that, even from my perspective, compelling research will often be confined to pilot projects without broader impact, or be on conference slides by academics instead of being in cabinet drafts for Kabinettsvorlagen for new laws. So Bertrand Russell warned in 1933, and I'm paraphrasing lightly, that the fundamental cause of the trouble is that in the modern world the stupid are so sure of themselves while the wise are so full of doubt. And that's, I think, the fundamental trade-off that researchers face when they engage with, the public sphere, because doubt and self-doubt is kind of like the core ethos of research and of science, right? There's no fundamental, universal truth. It's always kind of like an iterative process. But at the same time, retreating from the public discourse, which in some sense demands, self-confidence and confidence in, results and so on, in findings, would be fatal. Especially in light of the democratic erosion, I think it's essential, or the erosion of, all institutions that are kind of like the bulwarks of, liberal democracy, be it like journalism, universities, the court system, and so on. I think researchers will have to get involved and contribute to the discourse. And based on this context, I would like to propose 5 principles for researchers that want to engage in evidence-based policy discussions, and I want to put them up for debate here. So the first one would be clarity about our roles and about our judgment calls. So when we contribute to the discourse, when we engage in policy making, I think it's very important to really clarify when we speak as researchers that are presenting scientific evidence, and when we speak as citizens that, of course, have the right to personal opinions, to value judgments, and so on. I think it's very important, to the best of our ability, to distinguish between these 2 different roles, even though it's, of course, one person wearing different hats. I think it's a key foundation for the integrity of our work, and that, in turn, for the trust that the public can have in what we do. The second one will be transparency about uncertainty. So we need to openly communicate where are the limits of our knowledge. So that's a really tough one, because I think it's a fundamental problem. There's really interesting recent work by Thomas Gräber, Jacquette Noy, and Chris Roth, who documented how hard it is to communicate uncertainty verbally, for example. Okay, it's like communication is hard. Communicating second-order facts, especially uncertainty, is especially hard. Yet, so it's a fundamental problem, essentially, of communication, of human perception, perhaps. But still, I think it's our duty to openly communicate both the strength as well as the limits of the evidence that we bring to bear, for example. So that will also entail regularly also admitting when we don't know or cannot know something with a, you know, and that's often the case because, you know, many policy questions are actually hard and not, you know, sometimes answerable by an RCT. So I think that's also open to communicate. The third one was intelligible speech. So I think we need to like boil down complex ideas that they're available to a broader public without, you know, without risking to have like let go of like scientific, you know, exactness, and also like the second principle, being transparent about the uncertainty. So that's really a tall order, but I think it is what's before us. The fourth one is being open for dialogue. So I think this whole process is not a one-way street, but ideally a communicative process that works in multiple different ways. So I think as researchers, really need to be open to true exchanges with policymakers, with other experts from different disciplines, with citizens. That means, you know, answering questions, also accepting criticism, and a lot of listening rather than speaking. And the last one would be transparency about conflicts of interest. So I think that starts with each one of us, where we need to, you know, it's something each of us can do, kind of like transparently communicate where perhaps, you know, our own conflicts of interest lie. And I think it would be even better, and I think that's something that we need to do in Germany even more so, have like more universal norms around communicating conflicts of interest. So I think US universities do a substantially better job. I think whenever I have like any type of outside engagement, I need to report it to my employer. Nothing bad happens, but there is transparency for people involved, so they know, you know, and I think like something like that would be needed from like the public as well for each of us. So I think these principles are a crucial foundation if we want to, you know, reach the goals I outlined at the beginning. And I think in the light of time, I will leave it at that, and we'll look forward to hopefully interesting discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. If I could please invite the other panelists to join us on the stage now, and I'm going to do some introductions. Yes, please just go ahead, and then in the order that you sit down, I will try to do the introductions. All right, so first we have Malte Petersen, who's sitting down at the very end, who is working in the behavioral science unit of the German Chancellery. So that used to be called Wirksam Regieren, so a little bit also about impactful governance within the German government. One of the jobs also of this unit, though, is to talk more broadly about, or to deal more broadly with the communication between the scientific world and the policy world, I think it's fair to say. Then we have Jan Finken, who's from the German Ministry of Finance, and there he works in a unit working on spending reviews, and he'll be able to tell us a little bit about how the German Finance Ministry looks at the impact of German policies. And then we've got Judith Peterka, who's an AI expert in the German government. She's currently also in the German Chancellery. She used to work at the Labor Ministry, working in an AI observatory, looking at the role of AI for work and society. And she's also worked a lot in the UK public service on similar topics. So it'll be very easy, I'm sure, to do the simultaneous translation, given that. All right, thank you very much. We do have questions prepared, and we're going to try to go through as many as possible. But given Simon's fantastic keynote just now, please do think of some questions as well for the end. And I also want to start by perhaps declaring my own conflict of interest, because I do work for a network that very much wants to promote the ideas of more RCTs. So that's where my questions are going to go. But 100% open to discussion, because RCTs are not and might not always be the right thing to do. All right, and okay, perfect, thanks. All right, and also one thing I want to keep in mind is that when we talk about evidence for policymaking, we should kind of think about two dimensions of evidence-based policymaking, which one is the use of evidence, as rigorous evidence as we possibly can, but on the other hand, it's also the generation of new evidence through, you know, the evaluation, for example, of policies. Okay, so starting with you, Simon, you kind of talked a little bit about RCTs, but I want to, with my own conflict of interest very much in mind, press you a little bit on that. Why are there not more RCTs happening in Germany, maybe from your time with the Economic Ministry, and why perhaps should there be more RCTs? What's your experience with RCTs, with randomized control trials in Germany?
Yeah, I think they're few and far between, and they're of course like a very valuable tool. Again, I mean, I think as you already said, they're not the only tool, and there are some questions for which RCTs are excellent answers, but other times we're lacking even more basic information, right? So summary statistics might be lacking, or kind of like a merge between two different data sets that would allow us, I don't know, how many X have Y or something, you know, which are like very basic questions that we can often not answer. So I think RCTs are an amazing tool to answer specific causal questions, and often those are very interesting, but I think they're one of multiple tools that evidence-based policy discourses will require. Why are there no more? I think it's the specific German factors that I mentioned, I think, or two. One is like the length, you know, RCTs, as you know from your own work, often take a long time, right? These are years-long processes, and if you want to kind of like look at like long-term outcomes, stuff takes, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years easily, and that's just much longer than political cycles, and I think that's a fundamental problem. And the other one is that I think the law perhaps reflecting the ethos of the ethical underpinnings of German society, I think it's like not very open to randomization of, for example, state benefits, for example, because of like Article 3 of the German Basic Law. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, so please forgive me. And I understand all of these things can perhaps also be adjusted within the the confines of the Constitution, obviously, but I think it is reflective of like a culture that's organized, that I think like follows very different philosophical principles.
Thank you. Yeah, in terms of the reasons you also mentioned in your keynote, I mean, I particularly like this sort of Kantian versus more utilitarian approach to policymaking, because I do think that's an argument that I've heard differently, not with a philosophical dimension, but with a sort of governance or policy making, or even how the legislation, how just governance really in those countries is structured. So in Germany and other European countries, very much taking a legislative / regulatory approach, where you set out the big principles, right, and you decide beforehand what the big principles are, versus perhaps a more Anglo-Saxon approach of doing programs that in a more pragmatic way answer specific situations in specific contexts. But so perhaps one way of looking at that dilemma is to think a little bit about how the German Finance Ministry, Jan Finken, thinks about the impact of German policies. So you work in this unit on spending reviews, and I'd just really like to know, so how does the Finance Ministry think about impact? And what sort of tools, what approaches, what methodologies do you use? And how is that perhaps different from what we've been discussing in terms of, for example, RCTs?
Well, first of all, I think Simon Jäger talked about the federal structure in Germany, and that also applies to the German federal government in itself, because every minister is responsible for what his ministry does, and that also goes into the realm of evidence, measuring the evidence of certain budgetary measures. So what we have been working on is not so much in the detail of certain methodological approaches, but more to but more on how to implement evidence-based evidence into this, policy making in the budget process. And all that is what we are working under is the efficiency principle, and what we're looking at when we're designing measures, that is all focused on whether we find the efficient solution to something. So coming from that regard, it's not all into what is a certain methodology, because the legislation in the budget realm has to cover all the different types of measures there are in the federal government. So we're talking about support programs, we're talking about investments, and then it's the responsibility of each ministry to figure out what they're going to do in detail in a certain measure that they're going about. So it's not so much the focus on what certain methodology is in the program, but how do we get a cultural shift into thinking about implementing measures that brings evidence more into policy making and the budget realm in general.
All right, thank you. This on? Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, I already made some assumptions on the differences between sort of different countries and different contexts, and you have worked both for the German government, you're working now for the German government, but you've also worked for the for the UK government. So just wondering how you see the differences between the two contexts, between the two countries in terms of evidence-based policymaking.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Maybe just briefly at the beginning, this is what I'm going to share now is my personal opinion, obviously. Just the always mandatory civil servant clause at the beginning. Yeah, so you asked me about the differences. Well, I think in the end, it's all same and different, because in the end of the day, you need to advise ministers, and that's kind of the goal of the civil service and also of the Bundesverwaltung here. But there are also differences, and I think in terms of the use of evidence, there is a difference in terms of the people, the processes, and the structure, which kind of makes up the culture, I think, of an organization. So let me just go through this briefly. So in terms of the people, you talked about knowledge brokers. So in the UK Civil Service, they do actually have a certain professionalization as how they bring evidence from research into the policy making. And they have that by actually having a profession that is called analysts. So this ranges from data scientists, statisticians, economists, social researchers, and they only do that. That's their role within the government. They receive special training. For example, the economists get a lot of insights on cost-benefit analysis or understanding policy evaluation. But they also have kind of a network of analysts where they can exchange standards and methods, talk about the latest research. And that is really helpful because they then sit within the policy teams. I was, for example, an economist in the digital and tech policy team within DCMS, the digital ministry, and I advised the Office for Artificial Intelligence on the latest evidence when they wanted to put together a strategy, or I helped them to set up a theory of change for the strategy or for an evaluation that they were going to plan. So this is really helpful to have this kind of knowledge broker as in a personalization really within the system. I think the second difference, I said, is the processes, because there are quite a lot of processes on the spending side, but as well on the regulatory side, that really demand the use of evidence, and the more rigorous really the evidence is, the better. So for example, on the spending side, if you want to spend more than a certain amount of money, you need to provide a business case, which entails a strategic case, but also an economic case. So you need rigorous evidence in order to write such a case, so there's really an incentive. And then there are challenge panels, so the best business case is the one that is put forward to the minister. So there's a real incentive to actually make sure their evidence is good. And similarly, on the regulatory side, you have mandatory impact assessments, and they're going to be published, so there's a certain transparency and accountability effect, and that also is an incentive to use the best evidence available and also ensure that there's evidence available. And then I think the third thing are the structures. So I think a big thing here is demand, right? Demand for evidence. And I think one reason why a lot of evidence is used is because there are departments like the Treasury, HMT, that are demanding for rigorous evidence. there is also the Regulatory Policy Committee that checks all the regulatory impact assessments that demands vigorous evidence. But actually also the top of the civil service, they demand good evidence. And I think that brings me to another difference within the two systems, is that in the UK you have one side of the civil service that is completely apolitical. So from the kind of assistant up to the permanent secretary, everybody is apolitical and they have to be neutral and partial. And so you don't have a change every so often when new government comes in. From the top, also at the top, these are very experienced civil servants who also kind of know about the evidence culture and can also foster that. And then maybe a last point on this, I think another structural difference is also on the research side. You mentioned some tips that you gave to researchers of how to engage with policy. And what I observed in the UK is that the research community in the UK has a much higher incentive to actually make or produce useful evidence, also in terms of like how they provide the evidence, to communicate the evidence. Because there's something that is called the Research Excellence Framework, and that is really something that kind of ranks universities. And one pillar of that ranking is how much impact they had into the policymaking process. And for example, having a workshop or a really good policy brief, that gives them good points. So I think that also leads to a better use of evidence in the UK.
Thank you very much, Judith Peterka. That's super interesting. We've talked a little bit about then, what researchers can do better, what policymakers can do better, but we also have practice examples already. So, Malte Petersen, I understand you've already actually implemented in the scope of your work for the government, within the scope of your work for the government, RCTs. So, can you perhaps keeping in mind a little bit, the guidance we've received from Simon and also just from Judith, clarity about roles, transparency, intelligible speech, and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about the hurdles and your experience with implementing an RCT for the government?
Yes, sure. And firstly, also from my side, the disclaimer that I'm speaking about my own views here. But nonetheless, I can share some, I hope, interesting examples. And a lot of that, what Simon, you said especially, resonated a lot with the experience that I have made by trying to produce and incorporating evidence in the German government system. So I myself have made the transition from science into the political system or the administrative system 10 years ago, and I think we were a team that was basically newly created in order to bring evidence into the political process. That was exactly our task, so basically what we're speaking about here today. And I think the assumption that we had in the beginning was that golden times are going to start now, that we as researchers that bring the methods can finally work on tons of interesting data and make good trials that have great impact and basically do something for the greater good. And I think after doing this for 10 years, we found out that, of course, reality is a lot harder. It's not impossible, but it's very hard to do good experimentation in the government. I mean, I can particularly speak for the German government, but I think a lot of the points also hold true for other governments. So, but to start with a good example first, what did we do? So, for example, one of the trials that we did was that we were thinking about vaccination policy. That was in pre-COVID times. I think now that's a topic that is very has sparked a lot of discussion, a lot of controversial discussion as well. But we were working on that matter already before the pandemic, which will bring me to an important point later on. Actually, yeah, I think maybe just to give you an idea of what we did. So basically the question that we had was how can we actually motivate people to get a vaccination? I'm thinking about the English word. It was about the measles vaccination, and basically we knew that too little people were vaccinated, and this was also due to a lack of information. So the question was basically how can we effectively inform people about the necessity to get a second shot. Quite an easy question, quite concrete, and so we were testing different ways of basically addressing citizens with this information. And there were different theories of what would work well. For example, like one idea was to go via the doctors, the general physicians, which people see regularly, and basically to ask them to approach their well, it's not customers, but their patients. With this information, or to do a direct information campaign, and with different formats. I don't want to go into too much details, but basically what we found out is at first that it was possible to do really big scale RCT in the German government sectors. I think we had more than 100,000 data points in the end from data that we could use. It was a cooperation with the German health insurance providers that was also possible, and we also had very sensitive data because it was health data, and we were looking at actual behaviors. So basically, if people that get a certain kind of information in the end got vaccinated or not. So a lot was possible. And that's a good that's a good message for the start, I think. But so the question is, why don't things like this happen more often? I think that's the that's the question. And yeah, you asked me about organizational hurdles. So basically, and I was thinking about what is it actually why people aren't doing this, and it's not that they're like, well, except from, let alone missing data, of course, that's a point. Simon, you've been talking about this, like the very scattered data that we have in Germany. But it's not so much about organizational barriers, but it's more about systemic barriers, and that's very much the points that you talked about. So one is the policy cycle, that basically we see that in politics sometimes the window of opportunity to change things is very, very small. So we've had examples where we've been in touch with topics that was that would have been super interesting for experimentation. And then we quickly drafted up a plan to do an experiment, and we're looking for data and all of this. And we were quite happy when we were able to produce results within a year, when that was the perspective. And that is way too slow for political decision makers. So basically, oftentimes they have a window of opportunity of 4 weeks, and maybe 2 months or 3 months. And at least that's the assumption by policymakers. If I don't manage to take a decision in that time, then either people will think that I don't know what to do and that I'm a bad politician, or the public attention might have shifted to a different topic. And that's also something that's really, really important, that public attention is vital to actually getting majorities for policies that you want to put into practice. And actually, once I've been talking to a colleague that had a very well worked out plan. It was not an RCT, but basically an action plan for a certain problem. And like all of a sudden, a situation emerged where exactly such an action plan was necessary. And she said, well, I wouldn't have been able to draft that within a week or two. I've been writing this plan I've been working on this plan for 10 years. And I just knew that at some point the moment will come and I can pull out this plan, because then there will be an opportunity, a window of opportunity, and then will I get funding, then I will get attention. And that is exactly what happened, but it took 10 years. And I think that's a very big challenge for rigorous evidence, that we basically, and maybe I stop there because we'll get into further discussion later on, that basically we have to know beforehand, before a topic emerges, that we have to produce good evidence. And sometimes this is possible. like coming back to the vaccination example, which was really helpful for us. You all know what happened after we did that study in 2017, 2018. I think I didn't mention that before. Well, you know what happened afterwards, that we had the COVID pandemic, and the question of how do we inform about vaccination, how do we motivate people to vaccinate, was one of the central topics of policymaking worldwide. And we were one of the very few countries or teams that had very specific data about its own population on that matter. But of course, we didn't know that when we were working on that RCT. So that's I think that's what makes it difficult, basically, to just know which evidence you have to, or how you can produce evidence for questions that basically come up in the future. Because when they come up, you don't have the time to, or you often don't have the time to produce high quality evidence.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. That's super interesting. And once again, I mean, Simon, your key principles seem to be spot on, because a lot of the points in terms of timing and incentives and so on really seem to be the systemic issues that come up time and time again. Judith, Peterka, you also implemented some RCTs in your prior work at the Labor Ministry. So I was just wondering if in similar way you could share us a little bit your experiences with that.
Yeah, sure. Just to clarify, I didn't do that myself. We kind of procured someone else to do that for us. But yeah, sure. So as you mentioned previously, at the Labour and Social Affairs Ministry, I led the AI Observatory in Work and Society. So it was kind of the mission of this observatory was to kind of analyze and understand the impact of AI on the labour market and on society, and then kind of use that evidence generated to then shape AI a human-centered way. Maybe hold it a bit further away. Okay. So we at the Labour AI Observatory then read a study by Mark Nitzberg from UC Berkeley, who already kind of 10 years ago, so said that actually for understanding better the impact of AI on the labor market in particular, what we really would need were like the RCTs, like the Food and Drug Administration in the US does. So we were like, okay, that's something we should try. And I think there was a momentum because AI had just become a priority across government. Our minister said that by 2035, AI will affect all of our jobs. So to understand in a very rigorous way what the impact will be was kind of high on the agenda. So what we did is we commissioned the University of Maastricht together with the Institute for Labor Market Research, the IAB, Institute for Arbeitsmarktforschung, together with Zukunft 2, to conduct an RCT in 3 firms, so really within enterprises. And so the idea was that they would introduce AI with half of the group, and then the other half of the group would get the AI tool a couple of weeks later. And so that we would generate data that we could then compare to see what the difference was in terms of, and that's kind of what we wanted to understand, in their productivity, but also in a kind of satisfaction with work and how they felt when doing the work and their well-being, but also in the competence profiles they were using with AI and without AI. And to be very frank, this wasn't easy. It wasn't even that much on the administrative level because obviously we made very clear to our colleagues on the budget committee that it wasn't was a bit of a risky research project, that it wasn't clear whether it would work. RCTs are a bit more risky than maybe other research projects, just doing a survey. And so we had to come up with a really rigorous plan as to if, in case this experiment would fail, what we would do instead, and that we kind of would only pay some of the funds if a certain milestone was reached. But in generally, everybody was on board. What was really more tricky was really implementing then on the research side these RCTs, because obviously the implementation of AI is not a very linear process. You go back and forth. And the kind of shock you want to measure in RCTs also is sometimes on purpose tried not to be that strong because you want to be smooth when introducing a new technology. And so maybe the measurement systems weren't quite that strong. But what we found out from this is that in general, yes, AI does increase productivity, and if only partly some of the tasks are automized, then the people are actually quite positive about working with the AI. But what was really crucial in our project was as well the kind of collaborative approach, so bringing together the social council or the workers' council, as well as the kind of enterprise leadership with the workers themselves, and to kind of together co-create this research. And this also showed that if the people are actually involved in shaping this technology, that it increases their happiness or their well-being with it.
Thanks very much. That's super interesting. Simon, before we also later on open for some questions from the public, from the audience, I just want to ask you, thinking about what could be done concretely in Germany to encourage a more experimental approach to policymaking. I mean, you had these principles, these very interesting broad principles in your keynote, but in terms of sort of an actionable, perhaps, thing that could be done quickly, I'm thinking about, I mean, some countries, I'm not sure it's a good idea, but some countries have like laws or like requirements as to, the evaluation of public policies, for example. Judith spoke about in the UK, some examples from the UK, such as, having a different type of civil service to some extent, right? Because we all know that a lot of the people in ministries are lawyers in Germany, and that comes with benefits and challenges. But what's perhaps one or two concrete examples of what could be done to encourage more experimental policy or experimental approaches to policymaking in Germany?
Yeah, good questions. I think in some sense of what the Hertie School is doing is, I think, like the right approach in some sense of like training people who are in some sense analysts, or that's, I think, like in some sense like the immediate, once you're done with an MPP or MPA here, that's an obvious job profile that you're, I think, trained to fulfill. So I think building up people who have that skill set, I think, is very crucial, and allowing them to, enter careers. I think some of the ministries, actually, for example, maybe the BMF may not even be able to hire graduates of this school. At least it was the case at some point. Maybe that's changed in the meantime. So the BMWK or BMW and BMF, I think, like the Ministry for the Economy and the Finance Ministry, I think, for a long time, in some sense, I think it's still the case, can only hire lawyers, formally trained lawyers or formally trained economists for their kind of a career civil servant. I would think that some more openness to, for example, what a policy school has to offer would be very helpful, because at the end of the day, personnel is policy, right? I think it was like Reagan's OMB director who said that. And I think talking about and emphasizing in the public discourse the costs of not experimenting and like being stuck in kind of like the bad equilibrium, when there are multiple equilibria we can be in, is very crucial to understand that, not doing anything also has big costs. Just because we essentially have like a cultural and institutional status quo bias, we really need to, I think, like engage in the communicative task of overcoming that. And then at the end of the day, I think the French say l'appétit vient en mangeant. So your appetite comes while you're eating. So I think, like, in some sense, we need to do it, and there will be some amount of self reinforcement. That once you do it, then you can point to successful examples of where RCTs have broadened the evidence base and were the basis for good decisions. That will hopefully be conducive to perpetuating that.
Thank you, and maybe that means there's some reason for optimism, given that we do have some examples of, experimentation in the German government. Jan Finken, sort of the same question, perhaps with a little bit of the perspective from the Finance Ministry. What do you think can be done to move further towards a world of experimentation in policy making?
I think what Simon Jäger said is right, and a lot of is already happened. A couple of years ago, the Ministry of Finance was only able to employ, at least at the stage that is economically interesting for people that did a full university study program, could only employ lawyers or economists, and that is breaking up at the moment because, of course, all the ministries, I think, get the notion that it's getting harder and harder to acquire personnel. But on the other hand, I mean, it's not only those people on the level where people that went to a university will deal with evidence-based analyses in the ministry. So our approach now in the past spending review, where we dealt with mechanisms that we could implement at a later stage to enforce the use of evidence-based in budget policy making, is look at the educational programs, at the further education of people that are already in the ministry, maybe lawyers that can get training programs on the use of experiments. People from, and I'm missing the English expression, from the lower levels, like lower paid levels of the administration, how that usually do administrative, scholarly educational programs. How can we implement the principles of evidence-based policy making into these programs? Or even the young employees that start their career in the ministries, how can we start them having an appetite for evidence and know about the basic principles at least, so they can at least be part in the administration of then evidence-based analyses, including experiments at the later stage. That's what we are working on currently.
All right, thank you. I mean, I am actually originally trained as a lawyer, so I think maybe that's reason for hope, because, you know, perspectives can shift over time, I guess. So Judith, Peterka, in the UK, for example, there are institutions that specifically look at the use of evidence. They were actually mentioned earlier today in the form of what works centers. Do you think that something like that could work in the German context?
Yeah, I do love the What Works centres. There are a couple of them in the UK. They're on different policy areas. And actually, in my previous, in my first job, I was a mathematics teacher in the UK. I'm a trained mathematics teacher for in the UK for secondary school. And I used quite a lot of the evidence of the Education Endowment Foundation, because they have it very nicely curated on a page where you can see like how much impact has this intervention, kind of how good is the evidence, how much does it cost, and kind of you can see, for example, that feedback is much more cost effective and impactful than, for example, extending the day of the school. So I think they're brilliant, and I think they're really good. But I now want to also kind of, I don't know, how do you breche die Lanze for the German government, because I think the structure is a bit different, and sometimes we maybe oversee that. So, and I can mainly talk for my experience at the Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, but actually the ministry works with research institutions that are very close to them. So I mentioned one earlier, which is the Institute for Labour Market Research, the IAB, but there's also the institute that looks more at further education research, and then there's one that looks at more at occupational health and safety. And those institutes, they actually do conduct quite a lot of RCTs. So Gesine Stephan, for example, she does a lot of research on social spending or further research, and she uses huge RCTs in order to inform policy making. So there is things going on, and also within the Labour Ministry, they set up a very innovative unit, which is the Policy Lab on Society and Future, where also the AI Observatory was based on. And there also they try to structurally kind of mimic a little bit what they had done in the UK, which is like there's one team that are mainly analysts and kind of generating the analysis and also introducing the analysis into the policy process. There was one team, mainly lawyers, kind of writing the law. And there was one team communicating outside and kind of doing the stakeholder involvement. And I think that actually works quite well, and is a good example of how we can implement more evidence-based policy making also within the German Civil Service. And actually, there is a lot of Hertie School alumni working at QMAS. Many of them do a professional year, and then many of them also come and stay. So that's also for hope. But maybe as a last point, I think what we really now have seen in the coalition treaty is that, you know, there is a drive for more impact-oriented policy making or wirkungsorientierte Politikgestaltung. So it's there. But I think what really needs to change is the kind of attitude across the civil service, because often when we think about impact, what people think is actually output. So law has passed through, check. We have spent all the money that was available, check. But we need to start thinking about the actual impact on citizens. And I think that is really an attitude change that will be quite, maybe take some time and need a lot of people to work on it.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. I think attitude change versus sort of the role of individual champions, because some feedback that we have received, especially on those labor market RCTs that did take place in Germany, also in cooperation with the Federal Employment Agency, I heard from conversations that I've had that, you know, that was also down to individual champions, both at the IAB and also the Federal Employment Agency, making that happen, right? Really pushing for something like that happening. Malte Petersen, perhaps one final question before we open it up to the audience. How well do you think the cooperation between the scientific world and the policy-making world works in Germany? So as Judith just already alluded to, we know that a lot of the different ministries actually have research institutes that they're very close to. I also assume that the RCT that you earlier mentioned, I didn't ask that at the time, but that was in cooperation with academic researchers as well. But in any case, how well does the cooperation work? And what perhaps ideas are there to improve that cooperation and to get more to a culture of learning, as also Simon was talking about at the outset?
Mm-hmm. Yes, to answer your question regarding our RCT, actually the RCT concerning vaccinations was in cooperation with insurance providers, which have their research units, but not a formal university. But we did other studies with research institutes and universities where we had a very good knowledge transfer and cooperation. Yeah, I think the answer to your question is very diverse. Like, I think that has been the discussion for the past hour, that basically the academic system in Germany, but also the political system, are very heterogeneous systems. And we are having, Judith, what you mentioned, quite some good research institutes directly attached to some ministries. We have some disciplines that are very outspoken, like if I think of economics, for example, that's a discipline that rather understands itself also as a political discipline, probably also historically, and actively seeks an exchange with policymakers. So that also helps a lot, because that's actually, I mean, if I come back to my former point, that basically it is possible to do studies and experiments in within the government, but it's possible, but it's not always feasible, given the amount of time that you have. So basically one answer would be to have a closer cooperation, that evidence that is produced in the scientific system basically finds its way into the government. Yes, this works well in some areas, and in others it doesn't. I'm a psychologist, and I must say, for my own domain, that's a domain that is quite far from the political system. So basically what we did now is to create a network, which we call Behavioral Insights Connect, where we have the actual aim to bring together policymakers and scientists from the behavioral scientists, so not just psychologists, but also behavioral economists and sociologists, for example. And we were just sitting together, basically, and thinking about how we can improve the exchange between science and policymakers. And we have a couple of ideas that came out of this cooperation that we are currently testing. So one, I like the word very much, that a colleague coined, the social science surgery. So basically that when we have a problem in the administration, we call the scientific network, and basically in a very short amount of time can bring together a network of experts, and basically science coordinates on their side and we coordinate on our side, and then we take this problem and work together, and basically know or basically make sure that evidence that is already there gets used in the design of policy, because that actually often can happen, that basically we already have the evidence that we need, but it's just not known at the places where people design policy, and that's one effort to basically address this issue. And the second idea that came out of this cooperation is basically that we have better communication channels, that we as policymakers also voice our research interests. That's something that is always very delicate, because we say we don't want to influence what people are researching on, because the freedom of research is also a principle that is guaranteed in the basic law. But I mean, that's, I'm also, you are a lawyer, I learned, or have a law background, you're not a lawyer, but I don't have a law background, but I would say that shouldn't keep us from voicing our interest. I mean, it shouldn't decide where money goes, but I mean, why not voice interests that are, why not voice research topics that are of interest to the general public and make them available to researchers, and if they want to research on those topics, that might also be to their benefit, because then they can work to make that to come from theory into practice, and that might also be interesting. And that's maybe the third issue. We need incentive systems also in science, because that's something I always hear is also gives you credit in UK, for example, if you do policy advice as a scientific researcher, and that's something that in the German system is something you do in your free time, because basically when you're looking for a professorship, publications count, but if you've spent half a year on a very interesting cooperation project where you've maybe have had great impact because you've solved a big problem, that doesn't give you credit when you want to become get tenure, and so that's also something that we can work on, basically to change the incentive structure. Yeah, a couple of different ideas that we're working on.
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting. That's also something that came up in the session, in the second session today, in terms of the incentives of, and something I see in my work all the time, where academics in our network, what they want to do is publish the, latest article on something that's super duper novel, whereas for policymakers often it might be actually super interesting to replicate something that's already been done, and just to see if it works elsewhere. And that just, we don't see so much of that, because who does that? But enough from me. Please, if there's questions from the audience, now's your time.
First, as one of the few non-German speakers, I just wanted to say thank you. But my question is about the potential role of philanthropy, in the sense of, in the States, my impression is that there's some areas like criminal justice or some wings of education where philanthropy, which doesn't have the same time pressures as the normal political cycle, have made progress on evaluation of potential policies. Is that happening in Germany? Is that of potential use to solve some of these timing frictions, or just in general people's thoughts on the role of other nonprofits? I mean, you work at JPAL, which is sort of, in a sense, trying to foster these sorts of things, but I'd be curious of the panel's perspective on that.
Who would like to take this question? I can say something, but I will first leave some space to the panel.
I think I can just give a very general answer, that I think philanthropy has a very different standing in the US as compared to the German context. I think, like, to break it down very simply, in the US, basically a lot of things that are financed by philanthropy in the US are state financed in Germany, and there's also the expectation, because basically people pay high taxes, and then they say, we pay a lot of taxes and we are more or less fine with that, but then we also want the state to provide any service that is necessary, and that includes research that we need to address societally relevant questions. And that's a very basic mindset. I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions, but it's just that philanthropy is a lot less important measure of funding as opposed to the US, I'd say.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think it's my sense as well that it's just like as a probably orders of magnitude more in the US. At the same time, I think it is something that in principle we should be able to count on the government for, because governments ought to have like a long horizon and ought to plus I mean I think there is like so philanthropy does many wonderful things. At the same time, there is also, of course, the issue that it's not exactly democratically legitimated, right? Like what, for example, questions get asked and so on. So I think there is a case to be made, and perhaps we need to make it more forceful that, we need to, that's something that the public, in my personal opinion, and I speak here as a citizen now, the public ought to, invest more in. So we have like democratic control also over kind of like what are the portfolios of evidence making that we want to invest in from a societal perspective.
Maybe I just want to add to the time frame that you mentioned. I mean, we've been talking about programs that are produced or are done or designed under a very short period of time, but of course that's not all the government does. There's a lot of programs that have been running for years, for decades, that are redesigned every now and then, and evidence from research projects can, of course, feed into those decisions in redesigning programs that have been running, or programs that actually do have the time that you should have to design a policy. There, I think, in these areas, the government itself can work on having evidence-based decision-making have a bigger role than it actually does at the moment.
Yeah, and perhaps, I mean, if I can add quickly from JPEL, I think 100% the culture of philanthropy is different in Europe and in Germany than it is to the US. And I think also going back to Simon's idea of this sort of Kantian versus utilitarian approach, the state does fill a lot of space, and I think people here value that, obviously. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But that then kind of follows through in that same logic, right? If a program gets implemented by the state, then also the evaluation and so on will be sort of done by entities that are connected to the state. And in defense, sort of like you did, in defense of the German political and research system, it is actually a very sophisticated system. So sometimes I wonder in my role, I would like to promote more experimentation in policymaking in Germany, but where exactly is the gap? Because there are the research institutes, they do some RCTs, not so many. Why is that? But like all the institutions and all the sort of, everything really is in place. So the question that we're asking is, for me, it's an open question. How do I get there? You did. Yeah.
Maybe I could just add one point. I do agree with everything that has been said, but I mean, there is quite a lot of philanthropic organizations as well in Germany who are also quite active in kind of the policy area, kind of producing studies, and they are being read and they're valuable. But I think what is really helpful, there's this tool from the KfW, for example, that they have built to kind of have an easier access to all of their studies and their evidence. And because a lot of the evidence that is produced, for example, in these research centers, that's not that easily accessible. So it's in PDFs somewhere, and it's kind of being sent around in a report every month or so. But if there was kind of an easy-to-access port where you could actually just click a couple of filters and then have the RCTs that you need for the current policy you're working on, I think that's really helpful. And KfW, for example, did that with the evidence that they produce. And I think that's maybe something that philanthropy could help with.
There was another question.
Hi. Thanks, everyone, for the insightful discussion. One question, one program that I like in Germany is the Digital Service, bringing in agile experts into ministries. Do you think there would be a role for something like that, bringing like more junior researchers or people that have just completed their masters for a year into ministries, basically like looking for possible experiments and like enriching the dialogue there?
I've had that question before, personally. So,
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea. Why don't you just suggest that? I can definitely take that away. I think who doesn't know the program? That's the digital service in Germany, and they have two programs. So one is like Work for Germany to try and bring agile work styles, but they also have Tech for Germany, where they bring in experts who kind of can bring applications or technical solutions. And why not have an analytical work for Germany and kind of work on building the evidence base in certain policy areas? I think it's a brilliant idea.
Any other questions? If not, we're at time anyway. So thank you very much to the panel. And thanks for your attention. And yes, towards more experimentation in German policymaking, hopefully. Thank you.